real and.
So you tell me, what is realistic fiction?
It's basically real and fake.
It's basically real and fake. Can you tell me what that means?
Real, some of it is fake.
Some of it's real, some of it's fake.
Oh.
Fiction means that it's not a true story. Realistic fiction means that it could be a true story. So there's events and things that happen that could possibly happen in the world, but this one is not a true story. But it is a fantastic story. It's one of my favorites. It's called Alabama Moon, and it's written by Watt Key. And if I remember right, I think this was Watt Key's debut novel, and I was blown away with how good it was. And all the students I've ever read it with would agree as well. This came out in 2006, so it's actually getting up there in age. A little bit older than you guys. All right, so Alabama Moon, chapter 1. Just before Pap died, he told me that I'd be fine as long as I never depended on anybody but myself. He said I might feel lonely for a while, but that would go away. I was 10 years old, and he taught me everything I needed to know about living out in the forest. I could trap my own food, I could make my own clothes, I could find my way by the stars and make fire in the rain. Pap said he even figured I could whip somebody 3 times my size. He wasn't worried about me. It took me most of the morning to get him into the wheelbarrow and haul him off to the cedar grove on the bluff. I buried him next to Mama where you could see the Noxubee River flowing coffee-colored down below. It was mid-January and the wind pulled at my hair and the gray clouds slid through the trees and left the forest dripping. I felt the loneliness he told me about crawling up from my stomach and into my throat. What did we just find out about Moon?
He climbed up to his stomach and out the belly.
A pretty important part of the story here.
Can I go
What happened to his dad?
He died.
His dad just died. How old is Moon?
He's like 6 or no, he's at least 10.
Says that he's 10. So the book says, let me see if I can find it here.
God.
Dang it, I just saw it. I was 10 years old and he had taught me everything that I needed to know about living out on my own. So he's 10, his dad just died, and he just buried him next to, or is burying his dad next to where his mom's grave is. So what do we know about his mom?
Yeah, she died.
Okay, so mom died, dad died. How old is Moon? He's 10, and he lives out on his own. Think about that for a second. Could you do that?
What's his name?
Moon? You'll find out more as we read. I didn't put a cross on the grave. I never knew Pap to believe in things like that. The only way you could make out Mama's grave was the ground that was sunk in over her in a 1972 scratched on a limestone rock nearby. I don't remember her face, but I remember somebody else in the bed at night keeping me warm from the other side. Pap said she reminded him of a yellow finch, which is how she stays in my mind.
Okay, I got a question.
Go ahead.
Who will he go with since his daddy died?
That's a fantastic question.
And his mama died, but his grandfather had to die.
So if his mom's dead and his dad's dead, maybe he's got some other kin, like a grandma or grandpa, to take care of him. We'll have to wait and find out.
No, but like, what if her grandma? No, I'm just saying, what if her dad died, her grandmama died, her grandpapa died, and her grandmama died? Who would he go with then?
It's a great question.
Yeah, who knows?
You're going to have to read. So let me go back to that first paragraph. It says, I was 10 and he taught me everything I needed to know about living out in the forest. I could trap my own food. I could make my own clothes. I could find my way by the stars and make fire in the rain. So that means he lives out by himself in the forest, but he's capable to live out in the forest on his own. Could you do that?
Yeah.
You think so? I could.
Why?
I could for a day. But as soon as it gets dark and all the animals come out, I'd probably be screaming like a baby.
As long as
I'm just being honest.
As long as I have my 22 on my side, I'll be
A
outside.
22 would be helpful if you're in that situation. Let's keep reading and find out what happens. I found a rock for Pap and scratched 1980 on it with a nail. After placing it beside the dirt mound, I put the shovel in the wheelbarrow and I started back for the shelter. The Cedar Grove Trail was the only one we used enough to wear out tracks into it. It was worn like a cow path from years of walking it with Pap. Not only did he like to come see Mama up on the bluff, but we used it as a main trail to check the northeast trap lines. It had been almost a week since I'd run any of them because I hadn't wanted to leave Pap's side. I wasn't sure the traps were tangled in the creeks, and I was sure the traps were tangled in the creeks, and it only made the sickness in my stomach worse to think that whatever was in them was most likely dead. Pap had tried to explain death to me, but I couldn't make any sense of it. Pap said you passed on and came back as something else. It could be a squirrel or a coon. It could be a fish or an Eskimo. There's no way to tell. The most confusing part of what he told me was that even though he would come back as something else, there would still be part of the old of him that floated around like smoke. This part of him would watch out for me.
Mr. Houston.
I couldn't talk to this thing or touch it, but I could write to it. I could make letters and then burn them, and the smoke would carry my message to him. When I got back to the shelter, I put the wheelbarrow and shovel away and went inside. I took off my deerskin jacket and hat. I lay down on the pile of hides that we hadn't been able to sell, and I stared at the roots in the ceiling. There was always a lot of work to do and no time to rest, but now Pap was dead and things just weren't the same. Go ahead. What's your question, sir? Presley, you said you had a question.
Well, do you know
Can you
what
please
a
stop?
kettle biscuit is?
Chris, please stop. It's pretty loud. Thanks. Say again.
Miss Harvey was talking about, Miss Rochelle asked me, what is a cow biscuit? I know what it is.
A cow biscuit?
Yeah.
Yeah, cow biscuit is.
That's not something you want to put butter on.
Exactly. It's a dry cow poo.
It is. So, back to the story. If Moon lives out on the forest, he keeps talking about this sickness in his stomach. What do you think that sickness in his stomach is?
That he don't know what to do.
He doesn't feel good. He doesn't know what to do.
Because his dad's dead, his mom's dead, and I don't think he has any family members.
Sounds like there's nobody else around. We don't know that for sure, but it sounds like he's on his own here. And you could imagine that loss or despair, that kind of sickness feeling in your stomach that you might feel if you had to bury your own dad and you're just a kid. Like, that sounds crazy to me.
And also, how would he be able to lift his dad?
How would you lift a grown man as a 10-year-old?
So I can pick up my 15-year-old to...
Let's keep reading. I thought about death again. Most things he told me made sense real quick. You boil steel traps to get the scent off. You overlap palmetto roofing so the rain slides down it. You soak a deerskin for 2 days and it comes out with 2 days of softness to it. I could understand these things, but what he said about dying and the smoky messages and his hate for the government, they were the hardest ideas for me to understand. He said that the government was after us ever since I couldn't remember. The shelter we lived in was set miles into a forest owned by a paper company, and it was a place no persons besides us had any cause to be. Even had somebody come by, he would just have to about run into our shelter before he noticed anything unusual. It was one small room built halfway into the ground with low ceilings, so Pap had to stoop to walk inside. The roof was covered with dirt and bushes, and trees grew from the top. Over time, tree roots had come down into the shelter and twisted through the logs and made their way into the ground at the edges. Everything that showed above ground was from nature. Even the stovepipe sticking up through the ceiling was encased in limestone. We practiced with our rifles 3 times a week. Our windows were narrow slits for shooting through the trees that you saw. And the trees that you saw out of the windows were pocked and chipped from years of Pap and me practicing a stage 1 defense. In stage 2, we moved into a hole at the back side of the shelter where a muddy tunnel led to the box. The box was about 1/4 the size of our shelter and made of steel sheets that Pap took from an old barn. An air pipe went up through the ground and was hidden inside a tree stump. Pap said if we ever moved on to stage 2, we'd cave the tunnel in behind us. We had dried food and water in the box that would last for a week or more. Pap said stage 2 would be hard, but the box was made to keep people alive when things got really hard. Be a while before they find us, he said. There were no power lines or roads nearby except for the path to the cedar grove. We switched our trails every week or so we wouldn't wear our tracks into the ground. We made almost all of our fires in the wood stove to hide the flame. If we had to make a fire outside, we used the driest wood we could find to cut down on the smoke. We couldn't carry anything shiny in the bright sun in case a plane caught the reflection. Our knife blades kept a thin coat of rust on them for that very purpose. Pap even said so far as to sneak up on the game from the south so that the sound from the rifle shot would be aimed down into the river bottom. From my place on the high pile, I could hear the birds through the small window slit as the forest grew dark outside. I was used to paying extra attention to the late afternoon and night sounds. Pap said if the government was coming for us, that's when they'd come. He got nervous and quiet when the sun started dropping. He liked to sit inside the shelter and work on chores that didn't make noise. The two of us sewed, whittled, scraped hides, repaired traps while we studied the forest sounds. But I didn't do any of these things in the afternoon after Pap died. I couldn't. I just balled up like a squirrel, and I cried. So things that we learned about Moon. Where does he live?
He lives in the forest.
He lives in the forest, but let's be more specific. What's his house look like? What's he live in?
He lives in the ground.
In the ground, so a hole in the ground, right?
And then there's tree roots coming into his house. And then there's, they have like a tunnel. And then he said if they had to go to stage 2, they caved the door in behind them. And they had like a week of food in there.
Nice. I like that you're paying close attention to the details of the story. Those details are really important. So Moon lives in a hole in the ground. There's a tunnel that there's a second box that they go into. Said that if they had to go to stage 2 defense, so stage 1 defense is right out their front door basically, or their small windows. Stage 2, Presley, make sure you're paying attention, please. Stage 2 means they're going to collapse the tunnel behind them, and they're going to be in this hide box that they could last for some time. He's got sounds like some food and stuff prepared to be in there. Sounds like they had a tube that they could, like an air tube, so there'd be clean air going through there. Living in a hole in the ground. The tree roots have like grown over it, right? He keeps talking about hide piles. What's a hide pile? Presley, what's a hide pile?
A hide pile is
I mean, it's a pile of hides, but what are hides?
hides is off animals like their skin and.
Yeah, so the hides are like the skins of animals. What kind of animal skins would be useful if you're living out on your own? Go ahead, D.
Buffaloes.
Yeah, buffalo skin. Now, this said 1980 is when his dad died. So that gives us a time period. Mom died in 1972. He doesn't remember her, so he had to be pretty little.
Yeah.
If he's 10 now, it's 1980. How old was he when he was born? Or like what year was he born in?
2010?
If he was 10 in 1980, what's 10 years before 1980?
1970.
1970. So that gives you a time period. It's the 1970 to 1980. Moon's 10 years old in 1980. He was 2 when his mom died, which is, he kind of remembers her, but not really, because chances are you probably don't remember much from when you were 2.
All I remember is someone laying on the other side of it.
Like keeping him warm at night, right? Yeah. Which sounds like something a mom might do. All right, so
2011.
let's go over what was happening in the world in the 1970s.
Mom died in 1980.
1972. His dad died in 1980. 1980 was when his dad died.
Mr. Houston, didn't Michael Jackson die
Died in
in
1990.
No, 2009. He died in 2009.
Yeah,
I'm not talking about Michael Jackson right now. I'm focused on this book.
exactly, Jake. I told you that.
So,
We're not talking about that.
what was happening in the 70s? What war was happening in the 70s? That would make people not trust the government.
The heat, no cash.
Wasn't World War I, wasn't World War II.
World War II.
It wasn't World War II. That was in the
World War
1940s. That was in the I just said it was not World War I. It's
Revolution.
not World War II.
3.
More recent. There wasn't one. Don't just shout things out. We had the Korean War, but that was in the 1950s. What war started in the 1960s to 70s?
Revolution.
Wasn't the Revolutionary War. That's in the 1700s.
Wasn't it the Indian?
Cherokee.
Be the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is a complicated war because people were, we talked about this in my
No.
5th or 6th period class.
Being
Why are you yelling out? There's
Vendor
nothing,
Nation?
there's nothing to yell out right now.
the Vendor Nation War.
The Vietnam War is what we're talking about. In the Vietnam War, you could be drafted into that war, and that's a more recent war that some of your parents or grandparents, possibly great-grandparents may have been a part of. Most likely grandparents based on your ages. And in that war, on TV at night, they might have a lottery and say, these lottery numbers need to report because you're being drafted to go fight a war that you may or may not have agreed with or wanted to be a part of.
Matching number, you told us in sixth
Yeah,
period.
so in
They
sixth
have the
period,
matching numbers,
there
and
you
they
go.
have to go to war.
They would have to go to war, which some people are fine with, but not everybody was. The Vietnam War became very unpopular, especially in the 70s. And I noticed that in that time period, this dad is very mistrusting of the government, saying the government's going to come get him. Moon's very weary of the government. The government's going to be after him, and if they come, it's going to be early at night or late in the day, late afternoon, it sounds like he said. So there's some distrust going on. Vietnam is going to play a part of that, but Moon doesn't know much about that. Okay, we're going to stop there for now.